Okay, Joel, go ahead.
Great, go for it, Joel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Public Diplomacy Association of America November Mid-Month Speaker Program. For those of you whom I haven't met, I am PDAA President Joel Fishman. In more normal times, we would be meeting this month at Dakar, shaking hands, having a drink, maybe an embrace or two. This format may be a poor substitute for all of that, but it's still the real thing and we can still have our drink, only this time relaxed with our feet up. Beginning today, we welcome the participation of the Public Diplomacy Council in these mid-month programs, much the same way we co-sponsor the first Mondays. We thank PDC, which is providing this webinar platform, and our tech host, Alastair Somerville. And now, it is my pleasure to turn the mic over to my old friend and colleague and former PDAA President Mike Schneider, who will introduce our speakers and moderate today's program. Mike, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Joel, and thanks, Sherry, for your leadership, and thank you to Alastair and to Olivia for the help in organizing this event. It's really important to consider the implications of the 2020 elections for U.S. international standing, how the rest of the world sees us today rather than on the 2nd of November. The media coverage that I've seen suggests widespread relief around the world and hopes that Joe Biden can right America's direction. Maybe the publics around the world hope he'll restore our ability to lead through respect for other nations and world opinion, and reconstruct the coalitions that once existed and shape a more consistent set of priorities and policies. But is this reading too much into the results? Does he have a mandate to restore U.S. leadership? Does the public here support a return to pre-Trump positions? And most importantly, from the standpoint of world opinion, can we hope that he can restore national unity in a way that regains a perception around the world that we're capable of leading? And that we have the domestic support for the stances that he might want to take. A lot to think about. There's so many implications from this election. We won't begin to conclude the conversation today. We're just going to start it, and we're lucky to have two very thoughtful and experienced experts with us to help us sort out the results of the election and the implications for our leadership role and for our public diplomacy by implication. Michael Gerson is an op-ed columnist for the Post, as you all know. He writes well and thoughtfully, and he's written very strongly about some of the issues of the current election race and for the future of the United States. He's a policy fellow with the One campaign. He's a visiting fellow with the Center for Public Justice and a former senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And as you probably all know, he served quite ably as President George W. Bush's chief speechwriter from 2001 until June 2006. One of the speeches I know has been credited largely to Michael is the 2004 inaugural address, where President Bush spoke expansively on the role and the prospects for democracy around the world, which was a really very important inflection point in our international engagement. Michael has a kind of ethical religious background too, raised in an evangelical Christian family in St. Louis, Missouri, attended Westminster Christian Academy in high school and Georgetown University for a year, and then Wheaton College in Illinois. Joining Michael is Mike McCurry, who is counsel at PSW, and where he provides counsel on communication strategies and management to corporate and nonprofit clients. And Michael is also a distinguished professor and director of the Center for Public Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary in DC, concentrating on the intersection of faith, politics, and public affairs. He's a veteran political strategist and spokesperson with the Clinton administration. He has served before that as spokesman. In fact, we first met when Michael was spokesman for the U.S. Department of State in the early part of the Clinton administration. He serves on a lot of boards and advisory councils, including Share Our Strength, the Children's Scholarship Fund, White House Historical Association, and the Executive Committee of the Global Health Initiative, United States Methodist Church. we're all hoping that you will both use this bully pulpit to make the points that you want to make about the outcome of the election and its implications. But just to start it off, I'm curious to get your take on whether the presidential election has provided a mandate for Joe Biden internationally. If it has, what is it? If it hasn't, what might it be? And from your standpoint, what should it be? And what are the implications for our leadership? So we'll go, Michael Gerson, why don't you start us off, and
Sure.
McCurry join in.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a few words before we get into a discussion, which is the important part. You know, some elections really signal profound changes. You know, the 1932 election really signaled a profound change in the role of government in our economy. The 1960 election signaled the change of generations, where you had the beginning of the World War II generation taking leadership after the war. And 2020, to me, felt like it should have been a change election. You had an unprecedented pandemic, you had a demand for racial justice, you had huge economic dislocation. But in fact, we didn't get that. We got what I've called a mirror election. It just held a mirror up to the United States and revealed us exactly as we are right now. And it's a problem in a certain way, because I think that every major group in American life got confirmed in their pre-existing views. So the Trump people got confirmed in their hatred of the establishment, their feeling of being cheated and looked down upon. Democratic centrists believe that they've saved the Democratic Party from itself, from Sanders and Warren and others. Progressives think that they've given up too much in a politics of moderation that never really delivers anything. All these people are confirmed in their views. And I think the reason, which I'll throw out there, I'm interested in Mike's view, is that our elections have become a function of culture. You know, if you're having a factual debate, you can adjudicate it. If you're having a policy debate, you can compromise. If you're having a cultural debate between urban and rural, globalist and nationalist, religious and non-religious, then there's a perception that if you lose, your entire way of life loses. And that, I think, it drains our politics of a lot of potential when it comes to setting up different alliances for various issues. I don't want to go too much further, but I would say that the 2016 election proved that you didn't need to have a policy agenda in order to be elected president. Trump, when you look at I've been involved in 3 presidential campaigns, his had no policy whatsoever, was entirely rhetorical. 2020 almost proved that you can win re-election really without accomplishment on the basic, most basic issues of our time. And the president failed on COVID, and we're living with the results of that failure now. And it didn't seem to make any difference when voters were asking the question, do I support him or do I not? They were asking the question for a lot of Trump voters, is he on my side? Rather than has he performed or what is his policy? I'll throw out just a few things that actually happened in the election, some of which were unexpected, some not. You know, the Democrats made a play for white working class voters by having Joe Biden as the candidate. And they made almost no gains among white working class voters. That it was a failed attempt. But they made huge gains among suburban voters who were repulsed by the president's character. And these were people who were Republicans 5 or 10 years ago that have really changed and shifted in American life, drove a lot of the change in the 2018 midterm elections. A lot of discussion about changes among Hispanics, where the president did quite well. That is, there were some places along the Texas southern border where he improved his results, where Trump improved his results by 50%. I mean, something's going on there. I think one of the reasons is that Trump didn't make immigration a huge issue as he had in 16 and 18. In fact, it was much more about, liberal cities and Black protesters, not immigration issues like he's traditionally done with the caravan in 18 or others. There was a small change among African Americans, but they increased in their turnout, but they increased less than white voters did. I don't think they played a really determinative role in, at least if you look at the figures, if you'd had the same percentage of Black turnout and their profile in the 2016 election for Hillary Clinton, she still would not have won. It wasn't as big enough to make a difference in that election. And I think there's some, truth to the fact that Democrats did not undermine President Trump's image as an economic manager when you look at the numbers. They assumed that COVID would make that case, that we had a bad economy because of COVID and COVID was his fault. And there were plenty of voters, including Hispanic voters, that did not blame him for COVID and trusted his economic management more than Biden, which I think really mattered. We can get into a lot of topics. I mean, why the polling failed and where this is going on from a foreign policy perspective. I think in many ways it's going to be a restorationist foreign policy. It's going to have the elements of an Obama third term. It's a lot of the players are going to be familiar players. And I think that's generally reassuring. But I'll hand it over to Mike to get his views.
How about it, Mike?
Well, it is awfully humbling to follow Michael Gerson in a presentation like that. And Michael, to begin with, I just have to acknowledge your courage in the way in which you've written and tried to define some of the issues that are important is really remarkable. And I've got to believe it's been at some great personal cost to you with friends and people that you've been associated with for many years, but your voice is so important, and the clarity with which you present so many issues is really pretty profound. And so it is both an honor and humbling for me to share the platform with you today. I just wanted to say that at the outset. Look, there are a lot of things that Michael has just kind of covered. I think a lot of what is really defining about the political culture that we're in now. We are in an era of confirmation bias, which he described, where people seek out and only find the information that sort of confirms what they already thought to begin with. And that may be reliable information sometimes, but sometimes it's often, this, crazy stuff that you see on the internet and social media that people pick up on and repeat and retweet. And then that adds to the very dissonant vocabulary that we have in our politics right now. And so we end up in this very, very polarized nation in which there really is no center. In the years in which I worked for Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he had a thing that he said over and over again. I'll try to imitate Moynihan. He said, the quintessential question of American politics is, will the center hold?
Right.
Will the center hold?
That's pretty good.
And I think that is, fundamentally the question we have. Do we have a center in our politics where people are not gravitating to the left or the right and finding some place in the middle where we find common ground? that is my greatest fear, that the ability to define a center in our politics is evaporating because of the polarization, the dysfunction that we see in our institutions like our Congress. I mean, it's all pretty dispiriting stuff. And, you know, that is, if I'd put whatever is the most important question on the agenda going forward is, are we going to be able to reestablish some coherent way in which we come together to address the major questions our nation faces? And before I get to, I think, our topic today, I would say I am not sanguine about the prospects for Joe Biden advancing huge legislative initiatives in this next Congress. I just don't think that support's going to be there. I think he's going to probably face, you know, the recalcitrant Mitch McConnell at every step of the way. So there's not going to be much progress that can be made on that front. I think he will have to, and there maybe will be some prospect of developing some kind of response to the current virus that we're facing. There might be some kind of relief package that's in the offing for that. I mean, that's a possibility. But I think the real change that's going to happen in Washington is that we've got all of these, you know, hundreds, maybe even thousands of positions that need to be filled with qualified people who actually know what they're doing. And so that there used to be a thing called the plum book. I think that's still around, where you identify the key roles in certain federal agencies. And so I think Biden's initial challenge will be to find the right people to put into those places. And of course, he will have to get a cabinet confirmed, and that's not going to be easy either, because I think there'll probably be, you know, very, very nasty fights over confirmation proceedings, whoever Biden brings to the fore. But on our subject today, you know, what are the implications of this for U.S. foreign policy? We've taken a huge, huge hit in our stature as a global leader over the last 4 years. And, you know, the unwillingness of foreign leaders to really accept the fact that, you know, Trump is the quote unquote leader of the free world. I mean, literally laughing at him at cocktail parties, which I think was one of the most, you know, riveting images of the last, you know, the last year. And what does it take to kind of restore some sense that the U.S. is an important leader in these important institutions that we helped build in the post-World War II era? You know, we've almost literally undermined any influence we have in places like NATO and other places in the transatlantic partnership and in what we've done in the Pacific. And what does it take to restore, you know, some sense of U.S. leadership and presence in a much more competitive world in which we face both Russia and China as formidable adversaries on the global stage? You know, what does it take to kind of restore some semblance of U.S. leadership in those institutions globally, when at a time in which we've kind of withdrawn and come back to a recurring isolationist impulse that exists in America to kind of come back into our borders and only take care of our own stuff at home and not about the rest of the world. And that is kind of where we have been drawn to in the last 4 years. But will Biden be able to restore some sense of, you know, internationalism or global presence? And I think his heart would be in that work, because he is someone who's, you know, he knows the world, as they say at the State Department sometimes. I mean, he understands what's going on globally. And I think that'll be a great advantage to U.S. diplomacy as we look forward. But here are just 4 things that I would raise, and then we can kind of get on with our conversation. I think the first question is, you know, who does he establish as his Secretary of State, and what will the role of the Secretary of State be? I mean, we can't, I'm not in any position to speculate on that, but there are a lot of good names floated for that, but I think that will be a very, very important appointment and one that we ought to look for carefully. And then the delicious possibility that Hillary Clinton would be at the United Nations. I mean, who knows? I mean, that might be just an idle rumor. But, the presence of people who can actually speak with an articulate and genuine and authentic voice on behalf of America's role in the world, I think that is critical. And we will need people who really can kind of command respect and command attention for what we are trying to say in the world of public diplomacy. I think the second thing is that I worked at the State Department. I think Mike mentioned that as U.S. State Department spokesman. And that is a very complicated building in many ways, but rebuilding morale at that place, which has been literally shattered by this administration through both inept leadership and through, the president's own words and deeds, but rebuilding some sense of confidence that U.S. diplomats around the world and those who work at our State Department really matter, and they count, and they're not disregarded, and they're not disparaged. I mean, I think that will be a challenge. I think the third thing is setting very clear objectives for U.S. foreign policy. We can't, take care of everything every place around the world. So we have to kind of define early on what are the very clear objectives that the Biden foreign policy will be about, and articulate them in a clear way that the American people understand. What is it we're trying to do in the world? So we're not withdrawing from the world, but we're engaged with very clear purpose. What is it that we are going to try to accomplish? What is it we're going to try to do? And then, the last thing is the obvious one, and I mentioned, we have got to very carefully rebuild working relationships with all the allies that matter most to us in the world, whether it's the UK, whether it's Germany, whether it's Japan, whether it's South Korea. We've got a lot of work to do on the diplomatic front to kind of reassure people that America is back in the game of being an international leader, because we forfeited that over the last 4 years. And that is probably, among many things, one of the more grievous outcomes of what the Trump administration has done to us. So that's a lot on the agenda. Where it goes and how it happens and what unfolds as we go forward. I mean, as we're sitting here, we don't even have, half of our country doesn't believe that Joe Biden is president. I mean, so we've got a lot to overcome even in the next fortnight before we even get to the business of defining what our agenda will be as we go into next year in a new administration. So I hope, Gerson, that doesn't sound too bleak to you, but I think it's pretty realistic.
I'm going to invite questions, and we're getting some really good ones from everyone. But I just wanted to make an observation and ask a little bit follow-up for each of you. If we have, basically, the election has only established that there's a cultural gap within this country, and that the biases of the two parties are being confirmed by each side by the way they see the election, that doesn't say much for national unity, does it? To what extent is that going to be extended into the international affairs field and policymaking? Will Biden be able to do some things overseas that Trump wouldn't even dream of doing, or just a counter of that, without having too much flack from those who think they should have won the election?
I can
please
put out an answer for what it's worth. I agree with Mike on this. It depends on the topic. But when I talked recently with someone who's likely to be in the administration and asked what their major foreign policy goals are, the first one is international pandemic response, which I think they can do a considerable amount on. And if they were to leave a legacy on that issue alone,
Right.
that would be a very positive Biden emphasis. The other one they mention is climate.
Yeah.
And I'm just much less confident that they can, insofar as you need legislative approval on climate, that has just strangely become a culture war issue in America.
Yeah.
Where you stand on that issue is like having a gun rack on your truck. It just identifies who you are immediately. And I think that's a serious issue.
Yeah.
I would also just throw out there that it's going to be interesting what happens in these two special elections in Georgia to the control of the Senate, because I think that the administration would have a lot more leeway on personnel matters if they have control of the Senate. And it matters, for example, and this is a Republican who knows nothing talking about this, but I could imagine if the Democrats controlled the Senate that they could pass Susan Rice as Secretary of State. I think it would be much less likely for under Republican control. I think if there's Republican control, it recommends somebody like Chris Coons, who was one of the most popular members of the Senate and in fact would get overwhelming support. But it's, so some of this just depends on the next step that we're going to see in December too.
Mike, want to weigh in?
Well, but I totally agree with that. And by the way, also have a great fondness for Chris Coons. He's a very interesting, adept guy and theologically trained. I think he went to Yale Divinity School. So I always have some appreciation for people who, turn to a little bit of theology at points. But I think the question is really, is there such a thing as unity that can be established in our political culture now, given how polarized and dysfunctional some of our institutions are? And I agree with Michael that it will be around achievements on things that really matter to people. I think first and foremost, obviously dealing with the pandemic and how we respond to the virus and how we deal with that. And that has already become political. The governor of Michigan has just ordered widespread shutdowns, and she will take a lot of political grief for that. But I think as the results of that pandemic become clearer and clearer to every family, even those who, sort of think wearing a mask is a political statement of incorrectness, I think, we'll begin to see some change on that front. And I think that will affect what is the popular political order. I think there are a couple of positive things to say. I want to do a shout out to Ron Klain, a good friend of mine. My only regret is that I won't be able to go and teach at his course at Georgetown, which I do every semester, because he probably will be otherwise occupied. But he's an exceptionally good guy and really understands a lot of stuff because of his work on Ebola and other things. I mean, he's really kind of uniquely positioned to be a very competent White House chief of staff. And I think that will certainly impact the way in which the National Security Council performs and how our public diplomacy proceeds. I agree also with Michael that the urgent crisis of climate change and the inability of our popular mind to wrap itself around that and to really figure out we've got to do some things urgently to respond to that will require a different kind of leadership on that front. And that will be a difficult thing to do. I mean, Americans are going to have to change a lot of their habits and a lot of their ways in which they conduct their lives because of the urgent need to respond to this global climate crisis. And how we deal with that and how we get led through that and how we make the adjustments that we're going to have to make in our own behaviors will be a huge challenge for President Biden when he takes office and for his administration. So we've got a lot of difficult things on the agenda. And I get asked a lot, well, at the end of the day, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And my answer usually is, well, some days I wake up pessimistic and some days optimistic, and it depends on, what I'm reading and seeing, and then kind of depends on, what do I really believe better angels will prevail at the end of the day. And the best you can do is to hope for the best and hope that we actually do kind of work through a lot of these divisions and polarization that exists in our country right now, and come together and sort of say, we come back together as one America, and there's some defining things that we can do that will make a difference. My only suggestion that I've made to some of my Biden friends is, don't set an expansive agenda, set a narrow agenda. Set only the few things that you think you can actually really get done quickly, and take advantage of that brief period in which you've got momentum before things start to, evaporate a little bit, and try to get some serious things done in the first, year of the new administration, and then build on that agenda and build on that progress. But, the worst thing in the world would be to have a 10-point program, to have a State of the Union address, which, by the way, if memory serves me right, it'll be the State of the Union address will be given by Donald Trump, if there is one.
No, actually, I think that the new president will deliver a budget priority speech. That's what we
right.
Right.
Rather than the State of the Union kind of, it's.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Either, Trump could do a farewell message, but I wouldn't think it'd be more than a tweet.
Well,
you can imagine what that'll say.
All of these presidential public traditions are just so complicated now. Like I read today, I was thinking about this. Is Donald Trump going to pardon the turkey in the Rose Garden? Or deliver it to himself?
That's going to be a moment of. Well, we all should stay tuned for that one. The implications will be very important. So we have a lot of questions, and what I'm hoping to do is get to everyone so far, but not in exactly the order that we received them, because I do want to go a little bit from the general down to the specific. So I wanted to bring up a question that Michael Korf asked. Mike McCurry talks about no quote unquote middle, but is that really the issue? Trump is not really on the right. Isn't it really a different question? Isn't it closer to what Michael Gerson posed, that we have moved beyond right and left? Either want to take, Mike McCurry, you want to take a try at that, and Michael?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Are we defined by our political leanings on the political spectrum, right to left, or more, I think, as Michael was leaning towards, on cultural differences? Are there, ways in which we are really more defined in self-identity through who we are and how we live, and what our community associations are? And I ponder that question a lot. I've got a lot of close relatives down in South Carolina who I would say are good Second Amendment, gun-carrying, cultural conservatives. And their complaint, when the rare times that we actually talk about politics where we're not drinking Bud Light, is that as one of my cousins said, he said, Mike, the problem with all of you is it's we don't care about our guns. We don't need to have semi-automatic weapons in the streets of Atlanta. But the problem is you just don't respect who we are and what we like to do in our lives. You look down your nose at us. And I think there is something to that. There's kind of a cultural elitism that goes with a lot of people who are smart and intellectual and Ivy League educated. And they sort of say, it was at the heart of why Hillary's comment on deplorables struck home so hard for people, because you are looking down at us rather than respecting who we are and how we live our lives. And I think that is probably, to me, is the great challenge that we face. And if there's going to be a center, to go to the question, it's going to be because we begin to respect who we are and how we live our lives, and we don't disregard or disrespect the things people do to live out their life of happiness and pursuit of happiness. I mean, that's what we're entitled to as Americans, and people will have different ways of doing that. And if we don't kind of have some level of respect for how people live their lives and what they want to do with them, and don't sneer at them, then, you know, we will be in the same bad place that we're in. So I think it's part of this is, how do you build relationships? How do you really understand people who come from a much different background in a different place? Because we don't have many opportunities to do that. We don't have places where we are set up to do that. And I do a lot of work saying the church ought to be a place where we do that, where we try to encounter the other and have some respect. But that is a very difficult and fraught exercise, believe me. I don't want to go on about that, but you know, we don't have many institutions that really draw us together in community so that we actually do discover some common good, some common ground. And I think how do we rebuild that, or how do we develop that, is one of the real challenges that we will face going forward.
Right. Michael?
Yeah, I would just say, I don't want to sound pathetic, but it's right now, it's much healthier intellectual environment on the Democratic side, where you have arguments going on, ideological arguments that are tough arguments, but they're serious. And I look on the Republican side of kind of people like me, kind of never Trumpers or Burkean conservatives, and we have no place to go. This party now has completely abandoned. I know a senator who actually lost his reelection campaign this last time, who talked about in Colorado, he would go to events. In the state party is now dominated by Trump people, go to events and not know anyone. I mean, having come up through Republican politics in Colorado, it's a different group of people. And that is, you know, I think it's a real challenge, and it's a challenge on the Republican side, because we're not just talking about a policy disagreement. We're talking about, is there an objective truth? Is there a fact base that we can agree on as a people? You know, I've sometimes said that we used to have arguments on the different ways up the mountain. Okay, Democrats want one way, Republicans want the same. But now we have two mountains of facts, completely different from one another, and fed by conspiracy theories. So I think the Republican side has a lot of reclamation to do, on an epistemological reclamation, where it's just recovering the idea of truth. And that's really one of the terrible things about what we're seeing in the transition right now, is that attitude toward, that casual attitude towards the existence of objective truth has now been applied in our transition, our electoral transition. And it's causing a huge amount of future issues, in my view.
Right.
And so, anyway, that's our challenge on the Republican side.
Thank you. Colleague Adam Powell, who was formerly head of the Public Diplomacy Council and is the executive director of the USC Election Cybersecurity Initiative, conducted a series of polls and visits to all the states around the nation. And what he came up with is that they discovered that bipartisanship is alive and well in the middle of the country, far more than in DC, and that the polls conducted by state and local pollsters were far more accurate than the polls done by the coastal media. So he's asking, why is there such a disconnect between DC and the New York-based media, according to Adam, and the rest of the country? If we assume that there is more revealed in the kind of polling that he did and the studies that they did. And if so, and I'm extending this question a little bit, is there some basis on which to proceed in trying to rebuild, as you both say, some kind of a consensus or a national identity? Michael Gerson, you want to try?
Yeah, no, I would just say that I think it's possible, issue by issue. I think it's very difficult on the national level to do it as a kind of ideological alliance. So, you know, I work at the One campaign, which is an advocacy group on global development. And even through the Trump years, we've been able to develop, build and maintain coalitions around foreign assistance when the president's budget proposed to dramatically reduce it. And so that's, you know, there are accomplishments under the radar screen that you see. And there are, of course, Federalist accomplishments. You know, the governor of Maryland is a very successful politician. That happens in a bunch of places around the country. So federalism provides some hope.
Sure.
But I think in DC, it's going to be more issue by issue.
Mike?
Well, I certainly agree. I did a little work on the One campaign too a long time ago, and that's a good example. You know, it's routinely said, well, Americans don't care about foreign policy and they don't care about stuff. But I mean, that has been an effort where you actually could build popular public support for international development and for expenditure of resources for us to go in and address conditions that exist in those places that have extreme poverty, and that, you know, where we should be with the rest of the world that is hurting so badly. So there are examples like that, I think, where you can actually overcome some of the resistance or skepticism, or the sense that it's only America first, and that's all we care about. I mean, there are examples like that. I think we need to highlight that. I think our media needs to pay more attention to that. On the question of polling, I think that's a difficult one. I mean, we had, there was a good analysis in the New York Times by Nate Silver, just I think yesterday or the day before, about where did the polls go wrong? And there are a lot of possible reasons for that. Some is just, you know, there's people who just don't want to respond, people who just don't want to, you know, they get called on the telephone and you say you're calling on behalf of a national news organization doing polling, and you just sort of say, no, thank you. So you get a lot of resistance from participation. And I think that then becomes harder and harder for polling organizations to develop, you know, valid samples, so that they're really looking at, you know, who are likely voters going to be, what do they really think? Now, it's not surprising to me that at a state and local level, you probably have better success at identifying people who can actually respond to those polls than you would in some kind of national sample, which is maybe why, you know, the national samples were off in many cases. Now, they, you know, remember, they still predicted the Biden win, just as in 2016, they predicted that Hillary Clinton would get a larger popular vote, which she did. So, you know, but the whole methodology of polling, I think, needs to change. It's right now, there, I mean, I don't want to go too much into this, but remember, there was a time in when the art of public opinion research developed where the only valid sample were door-to-door interviews that you would do. And then finally that became too hard to do, so they moved to sort of saying, okay, we have to go to telephone surveys so that you can actually call people on the telephone and get responses to your survey from those encounters. And that's breaking down now too. So I think we are eventually going to have to see pollsters move to where they're doing more online sampling, using the internet, changing the way in which that business conducts itself. But my larger comment on that would be, we spend way too much time talking about polls and who's up and who's down, and, you know, what the spread is and what the horse race looks like, you know, as opposed to what consequential things are going to change as a result of the positions that the candidates are taking. And I plea all the time with my friends in journalism to spend more time looking at what the candidates are actually saying and how they're being regarded and how people are reacting to that, and trying to measure in public opinion research what you think that outcome will be, because you get mesmerized by these numbers that come in through the polls and you miss the big story. You miss the big story of what's really changing and what's really happening, and, you know, what's really moving the electorate. And that requires a different kind of journalism. If frankly, part of the problem is media organizations are going bust. Their budgets are down, and to send people out to do what David Broder, the infamous reporter for the Washington Post, did, the man in the street interview, to kind of go around the country and actually talk to real people. Fewer news organizations have those kinds of resources. And, that's, I think, the kind of journalism we need, the kind of reporting we need. And maybe there's a way through the nonprofit sector that we can supplement some of, the information that we need to get and replace some of the things that are just based on, quantitative numbers that may be a little suspect. My apologies to any pollsters on the line.
So Barry Fulton asks, will the media continue to provide Trump a forum to undermine the Biden administration? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, Donald Trump is not going to go quietly into the night, and they're putting up the fiction now that he will still be around for a second term, but he won't be. But he will not go away, and he will continue to tweet, and he'll continue to have a presence, and he will continue to kind of hover as a cloud over the Republican Party, because they won't know how to break out of that and find some sunshine, because he will still have this strong base of support that will reliably respond to whatever he's tweeting and saying. And then that makes it, I think, hard and complicated for more sensible Republicans to navigate in a new direction. So I think that's going to live with us for a while. But I defer to Gerson on that, because he would know better.
Yeah, what do you think, Michael?
I guess, a lot of people are asking that question. I think that being out of government is going to feel a little bit like exile for Trump. He will try to get involved in stories, but there really is a limit to what reporting on Twitter can do when you don't have power. And so I think that his views will often be noted. The problem is not that they'll dominate our national discourse. The problem is, as Mike correctly said, they're going to dominate the Republican Party. If you're thinking about running for office in 2024, Trump is going to keep that frozen for years, because you're not going to want to take him on. And so, we had an election result that removed the president, which was good from my perspective, but did not remove him as the most influential player in the Republican Party, as a humiliating defeat would have done. And so you have the spectacle now of a Senate majority leader. Deferring to the president's kind of insane conspiracy theories, not coming and defending our electoral integrity in a positive way. And that is entirely because he still has this kind of standing. But I would also just throw in that he may have his own legal and financial problems when he leaves office. He may be having to solve a lot of the way he's going to live, because we saw from a lot of this leaked material that he's a fake billionaire, and that has a lot of liabilities. So it's going to be interesting to see how he emerges, but he's going to need to make money.
Yeah.
One point I would add to that is that the next presidential election begins the day after the last one. And so one thing that could conceivably happen is that you begin to see rising some new voices and new personalities in the Republican Party that frankly would be more interesting and more compelling than Donald Trump. And that Donald Trump just ceases to be that newsworthy because of whatever he's tweeting and saying on any given day. Because at some point people say, well, who cares? And he's just doing the same thing that he's always done. And it's more interesting to look at some of these new people who are rising up, who are taking leadership positions, who are emerging as potential candidates in 2024. So we may see a shift in the way in which, the media collectively defined begins to focus on who the real personalities are that matter in the Republican Party. And that would probably, in my mind, would be a positive thing for Republicans. Not that I wish well for Republicans, but that would be a good thing, I think.
Interesting to see who will be the first to take him on in a direct way, and at what point in the cycle between 2022 and 24. Cynthia Eford asks, we're still more than a month away from the Biden administration. I'm concerned that there will be attempts to limit the new administration's foreign policy initiatives. The last 2 days, I've seen media stories with significant intelligence leaks about Iran with US and Israeli sources. Cyber attack, quote, parentheses, big-footed to make clear US role, would be easy for Cybercom to launch, especially given the new general counsel at NSA, who would be the legal authority and would roil Middle East policy, as well as our relations with European allies. Could public diplomacy in a new administration counter adventurism in the next few weeks? And I want to add, extrapolate on Cynthia's question, will any adventurism or continuing initiatives by the Trump administration in those last weeks really have an impact that limits public diplomacy and our statecraft overall going forward with Biden? Mike, you've been in
the good news that I would say is that anything done by a president that's not legislative can be undone by the next president if you haven't made the cost too high. So I've read stories recently that they want to pursue some initiatives, anti-Chinese initiatives,
right,
to box the next administration, and that may be a possibility. But I think people underestimate how a new president has significant standing for the first year and a half of his administration, having won a national election, that he is given some freedom, particularly on foreign policy, to do some things he wants to do. My concern is with the legislative element of that. But I think it's amazing when he takes that oath and makes that speech, that all of a sudden he has for a period, not for long, but he has a real standing and expectation. And I hope that Biden takes advantage of that. And I think that's a way to undo a lot of damage.
Yeah. Mike, you want to add?
I mean, yes, it's possible that in the next 60 plus days that Donald Trump could create mischief around the world. But, there are very capable and wise and seasoned people in our U.S. military and in our diplomatic corps who I think would figure out how to slow walk things that didn't make sense or were not in the interest of the United States and its national security. So I mean, sometimes that's frustrating to presidents that they are able to delay and kind of, obstruct certain decisions that get made. But in this case, it might be, it might be helpful to us that we've got people who will sort of say, well, let's think about that. Let's really look at that. Let's have a task force that will examine that before we carry out some of these orders. So I think even if the president tried, to do things that were, not in the long-term interest of our national security, I think there would be a little bit of gentle pushback or maybe even overt pushback from those who are in responsible positions. And they, they're very capable people. I mean, Gerson will say the same thing. The people that we served with in White Houses had their pluses and minuses sometimes, but almost uniformly, when you were dealing with those career professionals, both in the civil service and in the military, who really had the expertise and who did the briefings and who were, able to kind of bring just raw information to you that was critical to know, you were always impressed at their capabilities. And one of the hardest things for me has been to see how egregiously they were unlistened to during the Trump administration. They were not held in any kind of high regard. In fact, at times disparaged. And that's a really hard thing. The most capable people I ever worked with when I was at the White House or at the State Department were those career people who were there day in and day out. They didn't have any political leanings one way or another. They just wanted to make sure that you had information that you needed to make the right decision. And they were devoted to that. And among many other things, respect for our intelligence services, our civil service, the people who do that kind of work, who are career people in our government, who are not deep state people or something like that, that I hope gets restored when Joe Biden takes office.
Yeah. Don Bishop expresses a worry that the new PD team, the new public diplomacy team, may not be on board for up to a year, given the track record, especially if Senator McConnell is inclined to slow walk senior career appointments, political appointments. And PD people in the department and the field will characteristically wait for direction. Is the solution to allow career officers to make some decisions about how to present the new administration and present the U.S. in a time of polarization?
Yeah, let me lobby a bit on this. The quantity of people who work in the West Wing who even understand what public diplomacy is probably a fraction of the total that are there. And I think we've got to do a better job defining what public diplomacy is, why it's important, how it influences the reputation of the United States around the world, and why that produces real benefits for the American people. I mean, I think part of this is you've got to translate it into something like things are better for you in Milwaukee if we are highly regarded in the United States or in the world and selling more products and more engaged, and people respect who we are and what we do. That is ultimately part of the task. Sometimes this comes down to a question of the budget and how much is devoted to public diplomacy work, and what do we really do to kind of spread the message about the United States and how truly exceptional we are, although that has to be stated in a very careful way. And I think there needs to be more work on that front too. Like, why do we invest in this function? Why is this an important part of the work that the State Department and other institutions do? How do we reconstitute some of the agencies that have basically kind of folded or gone away that used to be responsible for what we call public diplomacy? I think a lot of work needs to go into that. And my advice to probably many people on this call would be to build up a good, smart, cohesive argument about why public diplomacy matters and how do we present that. Now, I know I fully stipulate that some of that work has been done. The PDC has done some of that work and has got some pretty good papers, but I think how to get them sharpened up and then circulating around would be a very, very important thing to do.
Can I just add one point?
Please.
Some of this depends on...
I'm sorry, that's my bird clock going off, if you're hearing that.
Some of this depends on answers to larger foreign policy questions too. So when we did PEPFAR in response to the global AIDS crisis in the Bush administration, it was a public diplomacy master stroke for the long-term interests of the United States. And we now are entering a situation where, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of the good global health work that's been done in the last 20 years is being undermined by the COVID crisis, where resources are having to be taken away from malaria and TB and AIDS and put into these COVID-related issues that are overwhelming some of these systems. And that is an opportunity for the United States. I think the administration should view it as an opportunity to go in and do some needed work when it comes to, we're good at global health work. And I think that has the potential for being an important, to reveal the nature of the United States in the world, how we respond to it.
Right.
Okay, I want to just make a quick point on that. you know, what President Bush did on PEPFAR and the work that was done, particularly in the area of malaria eradication, it is some of the finest things that I think the United States has ever done globally. And if you ask Bill Clinton, you know, what's the one mistake you made as president, he always says that he did not pay enough attention to what was happening, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, part of that is because of what happened in Somalia,
Yeah.
but avoiding, you know, what happened in the Central Lakes region and in Africa, and not paying attention to genocide when it was happening there is, I think he faults himself on that point. And I think we, you know, in our administration did not devote enough effort to that kind of work. And President Bush and his administration did, and it produced amazing results. I mean, we were making real progress in the fight against extreme poverty, and maybe still making that kind of progress. Although I think Michael is correct that I think the pandemic has now shifted the odds a little bit in that. But that is a place where, if we do anything, for God's sakes, you know, the humanitarian need to respond to people who are suffering in the world, whether it's from poverty, from hunger, from malnutrition, from malaria, from other diseases, you know, that's where we make a difference in the world. And if we can't get Americans to be proud of that kind of work, then we're going to be lost in this place in which we're trying to define what America really is in the world, and what makes us exceptional in the minds of the rest of the world, not just in our own minds. And I think that's an ongoing debate that we need to kind of continue.
That's fascinating. Michael, you were going to comment on that?
No.
Another question from Julianne Ponesco. Per Mike McCurry's comments about avoiding having condescending attitudes toward others, how do we deal with the issue of racism in America, particularly with foreign audiences? The Black Lives Matter movement must be both a source of inspiration, because other countries have realized that they have similar problems, either race or caste or ethnicity, but also, of course, it comes back to perceptions of the US and its question of unity. What do you think, Mike? Is there a way we can deal with racism in America internationally, or is it just tied up in what we do domestically?
Well, you know, our friend Michael and I know Jim Wallace well, when he wrote a book about America's original sin, which is really about the reverberating impact of slavery and what that did to our sense of race and how it impacts our culture. And I don't have an easy answer to that. I think there is certainly systemic and endemic racism that's built into a lot of things. But a lot of it is cultural. I think we've dealt with some of it that, you know, is at least legally, you know, we've dealt with some of the restrictions and covenants and things like that that have existed in the past. But it is a deeply personal thing. And we are kind of, we go to our individuated silos and we don't encounter the other very often. I mean, there are not a lot of opportunities for us to really engage with people who are from a totally different ethnic or racial background, because we just don't live our lives that way. We tend to kind of congregate in places where we are homogenous and we feel comfortable in the communities that we're in. And how would you deal with that? I mean, Mike, your question, how do you deal with that internationally? I have no idea how you do that. I mean, other than just providing a better example of how a multi-ethnic society functions. But I think it comes back home to how do we deal with these issues for real in the places where we live, and how do we really develop relationships that break down some of these racial barriers, which is not an easy thing. I mean, I plead guilty myself. I mean, I've got, yes, I have some African-American friends, and yes, I, you know, spend time in South Carolina and, you know, are in community with people who come from very different walks of life than my family. But is that really confronting structural racism in our country? Probably not. But, you've got to begin somewhere. And I think it begins with us being more open to how you make new relationships happen and kind of break down some of the barriers that exist in our personal lives. And then you can move on to institutionally the things that we probably need to do to affect the broader society.
That suggests that the organized religious organizations or other civic organizations have a really important role to play, because personal behavior, how is that easily affected by the headlines unless there's a community around that person? Michael,
Yeah.
did you want to go ahead, Mike?
Well, I did just want to add that, that's exactly some of the work that I do now in my work as a seminary professor. But we actually are trying to develop programs that really train church leaders to go out and figure out how do you actually build those kinds of relationships within communities, because that requires, I think, some specific kinds of training and a certain pedagogy that goes in a different direction than what traditionally is done at a place like a theological institution. So, there is work going on, but there has to be more work.
Right. Michael, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that was very eloquently said.
Great. There's so many questions, folks, and I appreciate the diversity of concerns we have. And we also are taking your time. If you are both available for a few more minutes, we have lots of questions to ask, if that's okay. The question from Leon Steinberg, which gets at the role of government and some of the initiatives that you've both been talking about. Can government be involved in these initiatives, or is it a matter of the private sector, the non-governmental sector, community groups, religious groups, others building? In other words, what does it take to get back towards some semblance of not having two tribes or two worlds and two cultures bifurcated the way we have had increasingly over the last 4 years? And
What was the first question again? I'm sorry.
to what extent can government be involved in this mending process, the
Right.
initiatives to build a more unified country?
I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of the relationship between government and the civic sector in the way these efforts are often done. I think international development is one of the best examples in the American government of the way that programs are implemented through trusted local partners, many of whom are religious institutions, particularly in very religious parts of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa. That type of cooperative relationship where the government provides scale and the private sector provides, intimate knowledge of local communities is really an example to the way government should work. And I think sometimes you have this debate about faith-based initiatives or other things like that. In our international development work, it really hasn't been much of a debate. It's been a success. So I think that's something to be proud of to some extent, as this is an effort that incorporates the work of American nonprofits, of local indigenous nonprofits, but would not work without the role of government in providing funding. The scale just simply would not be sufficient.
Sure.
So I think there's some good examples there to work with.
Sure. I mean, government money is always a significant source of NGO money, which in turn brings in energy and funding and dedication from a wide variety of people. So, Michael, to add?
But only to say that acknowledging how critical that role of government is, that those who denigrate government and claim government is the enemy or government is the problem, they impact our ability to actually use government as an effective tool in the common interest of people that we care about and are trying to help. And so some of the anti-government rhetoric and that we've seen now, literally for almost a full generation, I hope people would speak out against that and sort of acknowledge that, yeah, the government is important. It does some things that are positive and good. And it just doesn't just build roads or keep a military going. And we need to make that case more positively and more effectively than we do.
Well,
And
okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
I
go
was
ahead.
gonna ask, don't you think that there is also, though, on the other side, sometimes a fear and resentment of religious institutions when it comes to these efforts? So you do have some attitudinal problems on both sides. I
absolutely agree with that. I think that if we don't respect religious convictions of people who sort of say there are certain things that are bright lines for us that we cannot accept because they violate our faith principles, then I think we make a real mistake. And frankly, my tribe, my side, has been guilty of that in multiple cases, particularly in things that matter a lot, like how do we deal with health issues, particularly maternal health care in places like sub-Saharan Africa. And the role the faith community plays far supplants. It's so vital and critical, but it does not supplant what government can do. But when we put the two of them in opposition, which we've done in some cases when it comes to international development assistance or when it comes to global health care, and I think we've made a huge, huge mistake because we haven't brought together the elements that will actually create a partnership that could make a big, big difference. And Michael, I know you've worked on that, I've worked on that too, but we just have to kind of continue that work, that these are not polar opposites, that what we do to kind of respect people's religious liberty and religious freedom doesn't necessarily have to wipe away the things that we can collectively do for the common good when we work as we the people. And I think that's where we have to kind of like join that debate a little bit and get a little more clarity on it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
My goodness, it's amazing how much ground we've covered in the time that we have, and I apologize to all those who I haven't had the opportunity to raise your questions. I hope some of our conversation has touched on some of the basis of your concerns because these concerns are all very valid. One final question that I'm gleaning from several of the questions that I've gotten for you both. It's a little unfair because you're not in the administration, in the government these days, but you might have some views on what a good public diplomacy program ought to be like, institutionally or in any way you want to approach it going forward in the future.
I'm not sure I'm enough of an expert to speak to the details of public diplomacy anymore. Sure. I knew those issues much better when I was in government. But I would only refer you to the answer I had on doing big things. When the US government does big things in the world, that you get a tremendous benefit. Yeah. And that is one area where maybe the administration can be a little more ambitious. To really build capacity on global pandemic, dealing with global pandemic, or trying to shore up some of these other health programs. Right. You could get some real support on that. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, that does really bring us back to the idea of mounting an international campaign on pandemic that both shows our leadership and our capacity to share with others. It was a big deal for the Obama administration. They felt one of their great signal successes was the Ebola response, diplomatic response to Ebola, which was a whole of government, whole of society approach.
It should have been.
We've had coursing through American history this kind of isolationist impulses, and then times in which we are internationally engaged and want to be the leader of the free world. And that there's been a tension throughout our history there. We probably have been through a period more recently where there's been more of a tendency to want to draw back, and people sort of say, let's just take care of our problems here at home. We can't be responsible for every sparrow that falls off a tree anywhere in the world. But I do believe that there is an impulse in the American people to sort of say, when we can make a difference in the world, we should go make a difference. The number of people involved in mission work through churches, who go overseas, who are engaged, I think that gives us some sense that there is a desire, at least in some portion of the American public, to be more fully engaged in what we're doing in the world. And that is what I think we've got to build on going forward. And we've got to really define, to answer the question, we have to define that as public diplomacy, that is what we're doing. We're reaching out to the world. Maybe I hate to say this to the PDC, but maybe we need some better phrase than public diplomacy. We need something about it. It's like putting our best foot forward, or making a difference in the world. I will not come up with it in 30 seconds trying to be glib, but I think putting a real defining mark on what public diplomacy really is, and giving it a name and giving it something that is inspirational and aspirational, so people say, yeah, that's who I am. That's who I am as an American. I want to be out there in the world and making a difference. I mean, if we kind of create a different environment for that conversation, I think we'll be in a better place. Now, there will be, believe me, there will be plenty of time to fight over budgets and how much is going to be devoted in the State Department budget to public diplomacy. And, is there going to be a public diplomacy National Security Council function, and who's going to lead that? I mean, there'll be plenty of structural debates like that, which are important. And I think that's where the Public Diplomacy Council can make a difference, because you need to be in there and lobbying and working on those things. But don't miss the critical importance of having a message that's compelling, that really galvanizes people to sort of say, this stuff makes a difference. And it makes a difference not only to me and my family, but it makes a difference to our community and to our nation. So as much as you concentrate on the bureaucratic work, and frankly, sometimes when I've interacted with the PDC on other things, I mean, there are a lot of people who are, have been in the State Department, have been in career diplomatic roles, and they know the bureaucracy, they know the building, and they kind of focus more on that. My admonition has always been focus more on message, focus more on communications, focus more on the story and the narrative that you're trying to tell about why this all makes a difference, rather than kind of the bureaucratic squabbles that erupt from time to time. And then Gerson, you got Gerson, one of the best speechwriters in all of the world, helping.
Speechwriter, yeah.
Well, I think you both hit the nail on the head when you've talked about the necessity for engagement, and in a way, our engagement in the world will speak for itself, and it will certainly help those in the public diplomacy field speak for our nation.
I want to note for the record, I put my public diplomacy sweatshirt on.
I got it. Where did you get that from? That's wonderful.
I think from you.
Maybe so. Could be. Well, thank you very much, Michael Gerson and Mike McCurry, for a very enlightening, very encouraging conversation. I think you've shown us that our actions internationally, if the nation can be freed up to take on the kind of initiative you recommend, Michael, that's going to speak so many words, so many images for the nation. And then, of course, we have to hope that there are ways of building institutional support for more national unity and a culture that's more than just A and B and headstrong against each other. That's a real detriment to our capacity as public diplomacists to carry out our role abroad. So far, we've had to be clinical about what's been going on, and it's been difficult for people to advocate. And I think we hope that there'll be a new period of advocacy that will be based on something that's where the sum of our country is larger than the warring parts. Somehow we get at that. Some of the questions did ask and go into the question of how do you rebuild the center, and that's conversation for another time. It's really important conversation, but we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much on behalf of the PDC and the PDAA, and I want to turn it back to Greta Morris to have a few concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you again so much, Michael Gerson and Mike McCurry, for really providing us with some tremendous insights, not only on the election, but really more important, how we need to go forward to try to rebuild our country, but also to be able to make a really significant contribution in the world, which the entire world, as we know, is really hurting right now. So and your comments at the end on what we specifically need to do in public diplomacy, I found extremely helpful. So thank you very much. And thank you so much to Mike Schneider for arranging this program and for moderating it so capably. And I also want to thank Alistair Somerville and Olivia Chavez for providing a really excellent technical support, which of course without that we would not be able to have a program. And then finally, I would just say thank you to all of the people who have attended in this program today, which I think is one of the very best attended programs that we have ever had, and it certainly is a testament to both of you, Michael Gerson and Mike McCurry, that everyone was so enthusiastic about hearing you. So thank you. And then I would like to invite all of you to attend our next program, which will be on December 7th, our usual first Monday time. And our speaker at that program will be Robert Daly, the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. At the Wilson Center, and incidentally, a former public diplomacy officer in the Foreign Service. And he will talk about steps that the Biden team can and should take to manage our really rather dangerous rivalry with China. The title of his talk is rather intriguing, looking at flowers in the fog. So I hope all of you will be able to attend that program on December 7th, and there will be more information that you will be receiving later. So again, thank you very much to everyone for your participation in today's program.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jens.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greta. Thanks, everybody.